The British philosopher Sir Isaiah Berlin once suggested that philosophers are adults who persist in asking childish or childlike questions, and as we know, such questions can be awkward questions, undermining beliefs and the accepted wisdom of the age. This may help to explain why philosophers are not always popular. But I would argue that philosophy is no optional study. Society today faces problems as intractable as any in its history. And while there may be no correct solution to such problems as war, famine, environmental protection, and safeguarding human rights, philosophy can at least help by clearing the ground, by asking the correct sort of questions, by distinguishing matters of fact from matters of opinion. In this series, I shall be looking at some of the main strands of 20th century philosophy. And in this first programme, I talked to the philosopher Dame Mary Warnock, mistress of Girton College, Cambridge, and the chairman of the recent Commission of Inquiry into Human Fertility and Embryology. I began by asking her why individuals should study philosophy.
I think they should study it perhaps more now than ever before, because what philosophy does is to look at the principles and presumptions that lie behind all the different other fields of knowledge, like physics or like biology or indeed like history, and get people to think about what it is that they're doing when they pursue one of these other subjects, and what counts as good evidence, what they're trying to uncover, and so on. So I think that as knowledge accumulates so fast and changes so fast, there's a very good reason why everybody should have a go at studying philosophy as well.
That seems quite practical. That's a useful thing to do. Does philosophy also have something perhaps grander? Does it have a truth value as well as a use value?
Yes, of course it does, and I wouldn't really, feeling grandiose, I wouldn't want to distinguish those two, because I think anything that is true or that helps you get towards the truth must inevitably be useful. But I think that people who get really involved in philosophy, who enjoy doing it, always feel that they're getting a little bit nearer the truth. But that, of course, is true also of historians or of people who are interested in literature. What they feel is that they're getting a little bit of truth that they hadn't got before. So that's certainly true of philosophy. But I also think that it has this really quite important, useful function as well.
How does the philosopher set about his business? I mean, essentially, I see it as asking questions about knowledge, about the world as perceived or the world as felt. Is there a particular way that most philosophers will set about finding out about knowledge?
So I think the difference between the philosopher and the child who just asked a lot of questions, is that the philosopher who's professionally a philosopher will certainly read the philosophers of the past and start from there. Because somebody who has never studied philosophy may tend to think that all the bright ideas he has, all the searching questions he asks, have never been asked before, and then he makes a bit of an ass of himself. But in fact, if you start from Plato or even the pre-Socratics, you'll find an enormous number of familiar philosophical questions put in a different way, in a different language, in a different context, and you'll begin to know what philosophical questions are.
Yes, I think it may be Whitehead, once said that all philosophy is just footnotes to Plato, because Plato in particular was asking all the basic questions about the individual and society in the world that really every society since then has also been trying to answer.
I think that's a nice exaggeration. Of course, the fact of the matter is that Plato was a great philosopher and therefore did raise an enormous number of fundamental questions. But the role of the philosopher is also to keep up with advances in knowledge. And there are questions that Plato could not have asked about the physical world because they just were not known to the Greeks, and equally about the biological world that were not known to the Greeks. So there's more than a footnote of work to be done, I think.
So just to bring it up to date in the 20th century, the footnote would expand to take in perhaps some of the startling scientific progress, technical scientific progress, that as yet the world and philosophers can hardly begin to comprehend.
I think it should, but I also think there's a great deal to be done in the relation between the way we ordinarily think and talk and psychology, which has been creeping up on us since the 19th century, but yet we haven't completely adapted our language and our everyday thought to what's now known or believed. And so philosophy has a lot of work to do, I think, in that area of the human personality.
I think one of the things that people hold against philosophy, and perhaps I'm being unfair in talking about 20th century Western or even British philosophy, is that so much seems to be somewhat sterile, trying to find the meaning of words, the meaning of meanings, as opposed to trying to discover the great concerns of life.
I think that the Oxford philosophy in the 1950s had a lot to answer for, in the sense that we did all then enjoy ourselves greatly looking at the meanings of words. And of course, that is not a trivial pursuit by any means, because I think the great philosophical problem in the world is how what we think and say relates to how things really are, what the relation is between truth and what we can express as truth. And this was the great problem that Plato had to face. Well, I think we all do, and therefore concern with language is inevitably the great philosophical concern. But that doesn't mean we all sit around writing dictionaries. It means that we're rarely interested in what the relation is between what we say and how things are.
Yes, because language is the way that we share concepts and values and ideas.
That's absolutely right, and it is the medium through which we interpret everything that happens to us. So it is of crucial importance to philosophy to consider language, but not in the way that lexicographers do.
Are philosophers very important or influential people? I'm thinking in particular, we've had numerous revolutions in the last 200 years, to take three at random: the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Russian Revolution. All, it seems to me, owing quite a lot in their origin to the words of one or two individual philosophers sitting in rooms.
Yes, I don't know whether any philosopher could really be said to have started a revolution. But I think what does happen, in a way, this fits in with what I've been saying philosophy is. I think philosophers emerge at a particular time and look at what's happening, look at the new ideas that they're about, try to make sense of them. So that Marx arose, for example, at a time when somebody or other had to think what was happening with a newly industrialized society. Somebody had to raise all the questions about what the relation was between this new sort of workforce and where history was going to go. And Marx was a person who did that in the most inspiriting way, if I can put it like that. And I think the same is true of Locke and Rousseau, that for political philosophers have a tremendous sense of where history has got to and what we've got to think about in the next decade or century.
Just to take one of those people up, someone like Locke, for example, his idea of, almost a legal idea of contract, very much a product of his age. And are you saying that philosophers have this ability to not only ask the basic questions of Plato and, what is the just society, but also to be aware of the great movements and changes in their society? Marx with his theory of production and the relationship of the classes within that theory, and Locke with his idea of contract and human rights.
I think that you've put that absolutely rightly. I think philosophers emerge with their heads buzzing with the questions that are around anyway, or that's what they find most intrinsically interesting for the time being. And I think that's true of philosophers now, just as it was in the 18th and the 17th century. There have come to be questions that seem absolutely urgent. And sometimes they're political, sometimes they're more connected with, let's say, the status of religion, or with how we think about human beings in a more fundamental way. And that, I think, is perhaps the major question now, how we are to think about the human individual, his physical and mental composition. That's where philosophers have got to do some work now, I think.
Is this perhaps because you've mentioned that in previous ages, certainly in the West, you had the Christian religion and its concepts of authority, and then the concept of science really being the answer to all our problems and the answer for mankind. Both seem to have fallen by the wayside now. We're back in sort of open territory again.
Yes, I think we're back in open territory with an urgent need to redescribe some of our experiences. I don't think that we've got to the end of religion, and I don't think we've got to the end of science, but both have got to be rethought from fundamental principles, what they are, how they should describe our experience. And we come back to the question of language, because both religion and science carry with them a kind of terminology, a vocabulary that we, ordinary people, cart around with us. And we don't quite know what to do with it in some cases. We've got to think again how, well, words like the mind and the body are going to fit in to what we now know about the genetic composition of embryos in vitro. I mean, there are practical problems that have emerged where I think we've got to think of new descriptions, new language that will fit them. And this will have tremendous repercussions on the language of religion and the language of science.
To take your example of genetic engineering, which is an example of extreme urgency in the world at the moment, how can the philosopher help to try and help the legislators or the opinion makers or the individual who often seem to me to be blundering around in the dark, hardly knowing what question to ask about this?
Yes, I mean, I think they are blundering in the dark, and I think they do need help. And philosophers, with biologists and church leaders and so on, can help. What I don't think is that philosophy can provide moral answers. I mean, I'm sure that politicians hope that they will, and that they hire a philosopher to chair a committee, as they hired me, and that I know the difference between right and wrong because I'm a philosopher, so I can say. That's all rubbish. I don't think philosophers have any very direct impact on deciding what's right and what's wrong. But I think they do help to clear away the confusions, begin to see where the conceptual innovations have to be. I don't think we can decide what it's right to do about genetic engineering, say, unless we revise our view of what the human person is.
You say that philosophers are not telling people how to live, but it seems to me the very fact that they can make the argument more clear leads in itself to certain conclusions.
The only way in which I hope philosophers might tell people how to live is to tell them not to be dogmatic, not to be sure that they're right, not to be certain that the way we had to think about things before Copernicus is going to be useful to us afterwards. And that, of course, is the way in which Descartes was doing exactly what the central philosophy job was. He came into the world at a time of great scientific revolution and tried to make people think about it in a clear way. So I think the only precept that philosophers ought to publish, broadcast, is think before you make laws or speak.
Last week, you may remember, in the introduction to this series, I discussed with Dame Mary Warnock why philosophy is important, how philosophers approach their subject, and how it can help a better understanding of society. This week, I want to look at one of the main, indeed one of the great continuing strands of philosophy, political philosophy. I was joined in the studio by Lord Quinton, President of Trinity College, Oxford. A distinguished philosopher of many years' standing, he's also always been very active in public life in Britain. I began by asking him to define political philosophy.
I think one has to offer two definitions, as nearly always with philosophy. There's a wide sense and a narrow sense. The wide sense is just thinking about political issues in the most general imaginable way. Why should we have states? What should be the range of operations of states? What is the nature of law? Questions of that sort. And then a slightly more narrow, critical, even analytic undertaking, which is the business of critically investigating the way in which people argue about political topics. This is a standing back undertaking, as contrasted with the first one, which is rather like ordinary direct involvement in thinking about political issues. It's just thinking about them in exceedingly general terms rather than worrying about the siting of a motorway or the raising of taxation for the financing of local government or whatever it may be, some specific issue, where there's another activity which is weaving systems of political issues together in an orderly fashion and getting some total notion of what the state is up to, and thinking then about perhaps what it ought to be up to and how it should be changed and so on.
If we take the first of your definitions, it suggests to me that we are all, in one sense, political philosophers.
Oh yes, I think that's absolutely true. And that's perhaps one of the justifications of political philosophy of that kind, is it had better be done in an organised way by people who have studied a lot of political thinking of that type in the history of human reflection about political life. It's rather like art criticism. Everyone says, I don't know anything about art, but I know what I like. Well, in a way, the art critic is just a person who's looked at more pictures more carefully. And I think the fully fledged political philosopher is just someone who has had the time and inclination to think about politics in a general way that, as contrasted with most people who think about it fitfully, and of course many people perhaps hardly at all.
What tools can the political philosopher bring to this job of looking at society and how it is shaped and where it ought to be going?
Well, there are a number of other straightforward academic disciplines which he uses, like a cook going to various pots on the shelf. He needs to study political history, economics, sociology. I say needs to study. He doesn't have to be an expert in these fields or indeed able to contribute to them, but he ought to know what's going on in them, because he will need to refer to them in developing his ideas. The history of law, perhaps even to some extent psychology or the psychology of groups.
In a sense, isn't he really coping with the same ideas since the Greeks have been coming up in political philosophy? In a way, isn't he a bit like the farmer who keeps tilling over his soil year by year, looking for a new form and a new interpretation, perhaps?
Yes, there's a big point to be made in mitigation of that. On the whole, philosophy is conscious of its past and sometimes presents the appearance, particularly because perhaps of the way it's taught, of just rehashing an old repertoire of propositions or concepts or whatever they may be, like endless games with some battered old pack of cards. But the countering factor that I just mentioned a moment ago is, of course, human political communities differ so very much. We've got theocracies where some person or group of persons is regarded as pretty well divine. I mean, actually as gods, the pharaohs of Egypt, the later Roman emperors, actually took on divine pretensions. In a slightly diluted way, there's the doctrine of the divine right of kings, that by some mystical act of anointment, in virtue of inheritance, somebody is divinely authorized to rule. Now, that's one way of thinking which relates to a political system in which a particular person or group of persons is singled out very, very specially from everybody else. Well, then you get a quite different kind of social order, the Greek city-state. And, of course, it was in the Greek city-state that something that most philosophers nowadays would call philosophy really got itself going, it really came to the fore, became part of the texture of intelligent discourse, as one might say, a certain critical attitude towards beliefs. And the Greek city was a very peculiar and unusual political institution, often democratic in form and very, very democratic compared to our mass democracies, because they were small enough for every adult male, apologies to the women, every adult male to participate.
So would you agree with Sir Isaiah Berlin in his thought that really the history of political thought is the history of changing models, theocracy, the Greek city-state, the authority of the idea of the divine right of kings?
Yes, that's undoubtedly the thing that gives it its special character and perhaps imposes the obligation to be even more historically minded in doing political philosophy than you need to be in other subjects.
Am I right in thinking that political philosophy, certainly Western political philosophy, is enjoying something of a renaissance in the late 20th century? And why should this be? Is it something to do with all the social turmoil that arose in the 1960s, Vietnam in the United States, student rebellion, or is it something deeper?
Well, of course, there was something to react from. What had happened is that political philosophy was very much the neglected member of the family, of the philosophical brotherhood, as it were, in the period between, say, 1930, perhaps even a little earlier, from 1930 to about 1960. And it was regarded as almost a disreputable activity. And this was part of a state of mind prevailing amongst professional academic philosophers that they should be neutral as regards matters about which there could be strong differences of opinion. And so as far as politics was concerned, they restricted themselves to a very narrow critical domain, just saying these are the sorts of things people say, and all one can do is talk about, so to speak, the internal consistency of their views given their assumptions. The assumptions themselves are, so to speak, intrinsically uncriticisable. They're their starting points, and one just has to take them more or less for granted. And that very much dissolved, and I think you're quite right, that effusion of liberal guilt in the United States that started in Berkeley, California in 1964 or whatever it was, and in a sense transmitted itself to Europe, so the Événement de Mai in Paris in whenever it was, 68, and some modest turmoil that went on here. All this was an outbreak amongst the most thoughtful and actively thoughtful part of the community of a political enthusiasm. You remember the formula before then was the death of ideology, American phrase, or in England the idea of consensus politics. And that on the whole evaporated, and philosophy trundled along behind it in a sense. It so happened that there were, particularly in the United States, some very ambitious constructors of systems of political philosophy. The most notable and influential, perhaps, is John Rawls. Rather opposed to his views in many ways is an even more speculative construction that was put up by a man, Robert Nozick, and an American living in this country, Ronald Dworkin, has also contributed to this revival of political philosophy in what, when I was speaking earlier, I call the wider sense, where there's no embarrassment, as it were, about making substantive claims about how human beings ought to organize their affairs politically, rather than standing back and saying, people go on arguing about how these arrangements should be organized, and their arguments are good here and defective there, but of course it's all relative to the assumptions that they make. These people have been prepared to make certain assumptions.
You mentioned John Rawls in his book, A Theory of Justice, a very big book. I wonder if I could ask you, it has been so influential, if there, in the last, 17 years, if there is a central idea behind it?
Well, there is. And it's perhaps best approached in the following way. People in a politically excited state often express their political interest and involvement by making very strong, often indignant claims about some established practice or legal arrangement or whatever it might be as being unjust. But it's difficult to see what they're basing this on other than their own indignant emotion inspired by contemplating whatever it is they describe as unjust. Rawls's aim has been to put this on some kind of solid, rational basis that any reasonable person would agree to. And it can, in fact, be put forward, I think, without too gross distortion in a fairly brief way. What he says is that the arrangements of a society are just to the extent that any reasonable human being would have agreed to join a community with those rules if he didn't know what his situation in that community was going to be. This is a doctrine called the veil of ignorance, or the concept of a rational person making a decision of what sort of system of rules he'd like to govern a community of which he's going to be a member, not knowing whether he's going to inherit a fortune or be handicapped or be a member of a racial minority or whatever it might be. Just it's a complete blind choice. Just say, I'm a human being with the basic human needs. I don't know what my special situation and needs are going to be. What is the best most reasonable decision for me to undertake. And the analogy is partly, I suppose, with a game where you don't know what cards you're going to be dealt. But the game has rules, and you want the rules to be even as between the different players prior to the dishing out of the particular hands. And there's been a great deal of argument about this, and it's not, I would be far from saying it's universally accepted that he's solved this problem once and for all, but he's certainly enormously enlivened the discussion of the topic of justice. He's, if you like, rendered it much more intellectually discussable than it was, justice in the abstract, I mean, by producing elaborate trains of argument of roughly the sort I've indicated to ratify claims that one system is just or another. I mean, I'll just mention one kind of counter-argument. People say that Rawls ascribes to the individual chooser of a system of rules a rather cowardly or unadventurous attitude, as if he says they will choose such and such arrangements because they want to protect themselves against being dealt a bad hand. A lot of people say that isn't particularly rational. People aren't all that. It's not natural or standard or preeminently reasonable for human beings to be so cautious, so insurance-minded.
Some people are gamblers.
Yeah. And perhaps in general, there's no way of proving that certain sorts of gamble aren't reasonable to take. But that's a relatively minor detail. The interesting thing is it certainly has cast light on a great area of thought which was wrapped up previously and dismissed as, oh, well, they just have their views and we have ours, and there it is. It's just a collision of one emotion against another. It's like people saying tastes differ, political assumptions differ, and there's nothing to be done about them. What he's done is make it possible to go further back in reasonable discussion about these matters.
We've been talking about John Rawls and his theory of justice, and I think it's fair to say it's pretty influential in filtering through society. But are political philosophers of importance? Have they been historically of importance?
Well, I suppose the obvious answer to that is Marx.
Is he a philosopher?
Oh, very much so. His doctoral dissertation was on something in classical philosophy. I can't quite remember what it was. And he was perhaps, in his mature work, more obviously an economist than anything else, and his attitude towards the state, after all, was that it was the instrument by which the ruling class dominated society, and the ruling class was a product of a certain type of economic organization. So it was an economically based account of the nature of politics. And then associated with it, of course, was the view that ideally a form of socio-economic organization could be brought about, viz. Communism, in which there was no ruling class, no class division, and in a way history would end at this point and man would be fully emancipated. It can't be said that the withering away of the state has been very evident in the countries that attach themselves to Marx's doctrines. If anything, exactly the opposite.
Nevertheless, it is, to me, surprising or strange that so much of the world now appears to be Marxist states.
It's passed through a lot of practical political manipulation. Lenin wrote some philosophical books of a somewhat heavy nature, but he felt it was somehow proper to a person in his position to write philosophy as well as other things, as well as on directly political issues. But Lenin greatly transformed Marxism by the doctrine of the party, which reintroduced something like Plato's theory of guardians. Plato had, in a way, a very simple theory of the state. It was an anti-democratic theory that the state should be run by an intellectual aristocracy. And this was based, in a way, on an analogy with craftsmanship. The man who's good at baking should be a baker, and the man who's good at sailing boats should be a sailor, and the man who's good at ruling should should be a ruler. And then the question arises, who's good at ruling? And then, by a very elaborate chain of argument, Plato said, the most intelligent. Aristotle had an idea of God, which made God very like Aristotle, and Plato had a theory of the state, who made the ruler very like Plato. I don't know what one can say about that, a sort of personal equation in these matters. Curious thing about that doctrine of intellectual aristocracy is it had a terrific revival in the Victorian age. The whole idea of making the civil service open to any capable person via a competitive examination, and the whole meritocratic concept that people speak often in a somewhat disparaging way, all that is traceable back to Plato's doctrine of the guardians, an intellectually eminent and specialized ruling class.
Talking of the 19th century British society, I was going to mention, it seems to me, certainly in British politics, the continuing power of the utilitarians, the idea that society really should be for the greatest happiness or the greatest good, which I suspect really all our modern British political parties would adhere to, even someone like Mrs. Thatcher.
They do up to a point. The thing is that the utilitarians were immensely secular and in a way unemotional in their political attitudes. They wanted to eliminate all overexcited aspects from political thinking, to reduce everything to the level of, I don't know, laying drains, to put it polemically. I mean, I'm not opposed to that at all. What it meant was being hostile to patriotism, royalty worship, all these excitements with various kinds of politically glamorous things in order to concentrate on basic, hard, practical business. Perhaps they overestimated the extent to which people would be satisfied by rational provision of the sort that they were arranging. I mean, it's quite evident that utilitarian calculation didn't enter much into the vast enthusiasm of the Germans for Hitler. It was something much more primordial, the overcoming of the national shame of defeat in 1918, and the belief that they'd been cruelly maltreated by the victorious powers and that a great nation had been reduced to a penury and misery through inflation and so forth. And here along came this magician, as it were, and offered to transform their lives, and in particular transform them by ignoring the individual interests which the utilitarian wanted to serve, and asking everyone to immerse themselves in the idea of Germany and to be prepared to sacrifice everything for Germany. Now, that is a very non-utilitarian idea. Now, I think in English politics, although we are perhaps a little less excitable than the Germans in Hitler's time were, there still are plenty of vestiges of non-utilitarian emotion, if I can put it so, in the thinking of most people. The victory in the Falklands, one might say, clearly did something for national morale, that with the old lion wasn't completely mangy and on its back. And that, from a utilitarian point of view, is very irrational. The cost-benefit, a lot of people killed, hideous expense, and all the rest of it for what? So, obviously, the system of representative democracy, you have groups of people, as one theorist put it, competing for permission to rule, rather like businesses competing for the money of people who will buy their product. There are these various political firms offering their product, and the appeal they make is often to the rather narrow self-interest of the people whose votes they're aiming for. And utilitarianism is an aggregative theory of self-interest. And so in, as it were, peaceable, unemotional times, a utilitarian appeal will work. But I now say why a particular theory, which may be an excellent theory, and it would be reasonable of people to think always in utilitarian terms, is only politically effective, which is quite a different point, when the state of mind of the community is of a pretty peaceable, comfortable, practical, level-headed sort.
Super.
Is that all right?
Yeah, that was terrific. No, it's very, very good. Extremely interesting. That was slightly too long, but don't worry, that was my fault.
Oh, we can hack it.
Yes,
hack some bits out.
absolutely, yes. Shall we move on?
Fine.
How are you doing for time?
Oh, fine. I'm in no rush. I don't
Right.
have to. And my next appointment is actually at 12.
One of the major branches in the study of philosophy is moral philosophy. It's difficult to describe, but its study would include an attempt to evaluate the concepts by which people live and to clarify some of the questions that appear to be unanswerable. We all think we have a set of morals, but how have we arrived at them? Are they universal? And is there a continuing historical strand in our actions and values? Well, last week, you may remember, I was joined by Anthony Quinton, President of Trinity College, Oxford, to discuss political philosophy. And he joined me again today. I began by asking Lord Quinton to attempt a definition of moral philosophy.
Well, we're all, except a very small proportion of the human race known as psychopaths, moral beings in that we have some moral convictions which operate to some extent in guiding our conduct from time to time. To be a moralist, I think, is rather more than that. It's, so to speak, to broadcast, to propagate your moral opinions, and this you will frequently find this done by imaginative writers, by people whose position almost requires them to propagate moral views, clergymen, school teachers, even parents. Perhaps every parent, or pretty well every parent, unless they're, in current terminology, indescribably laid back, will introduce some sort of moral instruction into the bringing up of their children. So perhaps nearly everybody then, to that extent, is a moralist. Well, the next thing is, of course, if you're a moralist, you don't have to be terribly thoughtful or reflective. You may just reiterate the moral convictions with which you were, by some means or other, equipped by parents, peers, school, whatever, in your early life. You may just repeat this. But most people aren't quite as rigid, particularly in our society, as that. Perhaps people have been much more morally rigid in the past. I'll come back to that perhaps in a moment. And so they engage not merely in propounding or expressing their moral convictions, but in thinking about them and perhaps adjusting them in the light of experience, finding that, let's say, adhering to a certain principle in which they were brought up led to consequences which weren't satisfactory. It made them miserable and made a lot of other people miserable. So when this kind of unreflective rigidity about moral beliefs is abandoned, everybody does a bit of moral thinking. Well, at one level, at last to answer your question, moral philosophy is just critical reflection on moral thinking. What are the conditions of its success? How should it be carried on? What sort of consideration should it take into account? And perhaps, ideally, this might indeed issue in some fairly systematic survey of moral convictions, seeing what varieties there are. I myself believe there are some rather important divisions between kinds of moral principle, which, when one states this, everyone says it's obvious enough, but it doesn't always enter into people's thought. Just let me say one other thing, because I promised to come back to this, about rigidity in moral thinking. Our situation as regards morality is different from our forebears, because until comparatively recent times, most people regarded morality simply as a matter of God's commands for human beings. And those commands were either communicated pretty directly through a sacred inspired text or through an authoritative set of people who were under discipline, the church. With the coming of Protestantism, this idea of an earthly authority outside oneself, telling one what was right and to whom one just submitted oneself if one acted in a normal way at that time, that disappeared with Protestantism, and the moral authority was put within, but it was still seen not as something you generated yourself, but as a capacity you had for receiving divine instructions. Well, moral philosophy really has something to do when that authoritarian view of moral belief evaporates.
Just before we come on to the varieties of moral principles you mentioned, can we just make it clear then that the moral philosopher is not really in the business of providing a morality?
He may find it difficult to resist the temptation in the course of it, but I don't think it's his prime business. His prime business is just to understand moral reasoning in order, ideally, to make it more effective. Of course, if he thinks he's got onto it, that he's discovered, let us say, some really reliable mode of moral thinking, then he will exercise the procedure he's devised. And plenty of moral philosophers in the past have done this. But of course, one wants to keep one's feet on the ground here. He's not usually going to come up with something absolutely unfamiliar.
If there are these fundamental principles, and yet you said earlier that there were different moral principles, presumably at different times in history, perhaps you could enlarge on that.
Well, it's to some extent a rating of relative importance or priority as between principles. Another thing, and I think this is a very important general feature of moral principles, is that in the authoritarian mode, they tended to be stated, take the Ten Commandments, in a quite brisk, categorical way. Thou shalt not steal. But somebody comes along and says, surely once in a while it's a good thing to steal. E.g., when a madman is on the loose with a submachine gun, it might be a good idea to steal a loaded rifle from a gun shop to bring his career to an end. Well, that's a silly sort of example, but take perhaps a more obvious case where we would say this is surely central to all morality, is just honesty. And yet there are circumstances in which surely the right thing to do is not to tell the truth. That's perhaps different from telling a lie because you can say nothing or refuse to answer a question that's put to you or fail to say something. But there surely are, we can all imagine circumstances where it would be right to make a false statement.
Presumably you would make a false statement if that maniac killer told you where someone was that he was looking for.
Or yes, you asked where someone was that you knew. That's an ancient example from Plato, in fact, along those lines, though not to make precisely that point. And the trouble is then that the ordinary old traditional copybook headings need, as we all know, I think, on reflection, to be employed with a certain judiciousness. They're handy summaries for practical purposes, but they can't be regarded as totally satisfactory, complete solutions to moral problems. And this, of course, leads people to see, well, now, what sort of justification do they have? And one very familiar line is, well, we must consider moral principles which enjoin some kinds of action and enjoin the abstention from other kinds of action, forbid other kinds of action. We must consider these in the light of the consequences of people abiding by them and not abiding by them. And if the consequences are such that people are made happy and not frustrated and flourish and all those sorts of things, then that's a positive support for the principle. And if the opposite, then that counts against the principle. And defenders of that way of thinking would be inclined to say, well, what I spoke of earlier, that collection of specific principles of conduct that nearly every moral system has in some form or another, that collection can pass that test reasonably well. But now, all right, let me just say one other thing. There seems to me to be a rather unfortunate inheritance in a lot of moral philosophy from the old divine command way of thinking. When Christianity got going, you'll remember, it made very extreme demands on people because it was animated by the idea that the end of the world was at hand. And so really you didn't have to take any serious practical thought for tomorrow. You should in effect abandon all worldly concerns. Well, then the world obstinately continued, and so the church very sensibly introduced two kinds of morality. There was what I might call 100% morality for monks with poverty, chastity, and obedience. Now, this is a very arduous rule of life, and it was realized that this wasn't possible for mankind at large, and a 50% arrangement was made for them, i.e. the large areas of life were left to individuals to decide for themselves, and only a small area was catered for by morality. A lot of people thinking about morality seem to find it very hard to shake themselves free of this, that everything that isn't morally the right thing to do must be morally wrong to do. And this, I think, has a very bad effect because it leads a lot of people to say, well, morality is a very extreme thing. I don't want to have much to do with that. It's really for very specialized kinds of human being. It seems to me that what's important is to emphasize that there are certain things that really are vitally important for the communal well-being, and that these are, i.e., certain forms of action that should be abstained from, bodily assault, theft of property, and so on and so forth, that these should be abstained from. But as if provided you do that, then it's up to you whether you keep rabbits or do swimming. You needn't feel conscientious anxiety because when swimming you aren't, wrapping up parcels for the disadvantaged or something. In other words, I think often moral philosophers lack this elementary commonsensical idea that morality isn't everything. They're so anxious to accord it the highest possible respect that they don't acknowledge its limited place, along with other demands on human beings, the demands of personal prudence, of looking after your own interests in the long run. It's got to be accommodated with that. It's got to take its place. You can't totally submit prudence to morality. And equally, the simple pursuit of particular ends that people have.
Would you say that this is a particularly fertile time in the field of moral philosophy, the late 20th century?
Well, I think it's more fertile than the previous period. In our own century, there's been a kind of skeptical, minimalist retreat that people dealing with very small issues. The writer the other day said, some years ago when I was working away in the arid little garden called English moral philosophy, and I thought that was a very good little picture of what it was like. These little minute topics were discussed. There's been a great effort to bring the subject more to life by considering topics of major public moral interest, euthanasia, abortion. There are a whole lot of public moral issues which have come very much into the centre of discussion, and I am inclined, perhaps narcissistically in a way, to suppose that philosophers have contributed to enhancing the quality of the discussion of these subjects. That again, they're more or less professionally committed to trying to think the thing out to the limit as far as one can go, and again, trying not to get hung up at any point in the discussion on some dogma that they regard as undiscussable. This is perhaps the main point about philosophy. And of course, then what underlies that is the assumption of doing that sort of thing is beneficial. But if I don't quite know how to justify that belief except by suggesting that philosophical thought through the ages has contributed to the advancement of human understanding of their men's and women's understanding of the circumstances in which they live and the improvement of their lives.
You may remember in the first programme of this series, Dame Mary Warnock, mistress of Girton College, Cambridge, argued that we need to think long and clearly about an area that has concerned philosophers for centuries, the nature of personal identity. What is an individual? And is that individual made up of a mind and body that is separate or combined? And how does the working of the mind fit into a world of physical objects? Well, the British philosopher Derek Parfit, in his recent book Reasons and Persons, has caused something of a stir in the philosophical world with a new theory of identity. So when I visited Mary Warnock at her home, I began by asking her to say something about Derek Parfit's argument.
He is putting forward the very unusual idea that we ought not to be so much interested in each one of us ourselves as an individual, but that we should think of ourselves as possibly surviving through sharing ideas and thoughts and interests over a much wider field. And this doesn't mean just being unselfish and having wide interests. He has a great example about somebody whose brain is divided between the brains of two other people. And so then you can say that this one individual person called Alfred, or whatever he's called, actually does survive in two different forms, and therefore it's logically possible that each one of us, might survive in a lot of different forms over a great long period of time, over a wide field.
So therefore it would be logically sensible to think more about the future, because you will survive in the future, which might reduce your interest in your own body, in this particular space of the body being alive and dead.
Yes, that's what he hopes and believes, I think, would come about. We would, if we could get used to the idea of surviving, rather than just of being an individual who's born and then dies, but of possibly surviving in a much wider sense, then we'd start to be interested in our wider environment, in the future of the Earth as a whole, and so on. The whole thing turns on his belief that we could start to think of ourselves as possibly shared out among a lot of different individual bodies, whereas now we tend to think of ourselves, each one, as I, Mary Warnock, you, who was born at a particular date and will die at a particular date.
And clearly there are moral implications in this, some of which you've suggested.
Yes, there would be, and I think it's perfectly true that we ought to think of moral ways to induce ourselves to think about the future and the world as a whole, rather than each one his own little individual interest. I'm sure we ought to do that, but I'm not sure that I think that Derek Parfit has found a way to make us do so.
What Parfit is talking about in this instance, and what you've been talking about, really is what is an individual. Can I ask you how you would define an individual? I mean, would you go along with some of the things Parfit has said?
I don't think I can agree with Parfit that it's possible to stop thinking in terms of an individual being an individual body. A human being, a human individual, is someone who is born of a particular mother on a particular date and will live his life and then die at a particular time that we don't know. And that's what an individual human is, just as an individual cat is a cat that was once a kitten and will live 13 years or so and then at last be run over, or whatever it may be. But we know that that is Pussy, who has lived his life and is now at last no more.
And that individual is made up of a mind and a body? Are they two separate things, or are they combined?
Well, that, of course, the question, whether they are two separate things or are combined, has been exercising philosophers since Aristotle, Descartes, Locke. Everybody has asked this question. I believe that we now have to say that what the individual is a body. But the body is an extremely complicated thing, and of course it contains a brain. And that's true of the cat, and it's true of pigeons, and it's true of humans. We know extraordinarily little about the brain, but we do know that it's a physical object, like the rest of the body. It's a physical part of the body. So I would say that in some sense there is nothing in the world except physical objects.
So that if I have an emotion like pleasure or fear, it could be explained that this is just a mental process, something that happens in my brain.
You used the word mental process, and I think we're bound to retain a difference, a broad difference between the mental and the physical. And fear, joy, pain, some sorts of pain at any rate, are mental phenomena. And so is memory, and so is imagination and thought. And we need to keep that category, the mental. But to say that doesn't entail that all of our thoughts and memories are not, in fact, also physical events. The only thing is we don't know what physical events.
And these mental phenomena you mentioned, memory, imagination, how can the philosopher help us understand what is going on and what part they play?
I think the philosopher has to try very hard to get us to use a new way of talking, perhaps, about mental phenomena. What I'm suggesting sounds like a kind of reductionist program in which I'm saying all your most secret thoughts and all your fancies and memories could be described in physical terms, and therefore we could get rid of the mental altogether as a category. Now, I'm not saying that, but I think philosophy has to try to explain how these two great different sets of phenomena, the mental and the physical, are to be thought of in relation to one another. I think what I'm saying is that every time you have a thought, something is physically happening in your brain, but we can't and don't know what exactly is happening in your brain. You, who have the thought, have this extraordinarily different way of getting to know what's happening in your brain. Namely, you suddenly remember that it's your mother's birthday, or suddenly feel a sense of foreboding or something. Now, when you have that sudden recollection that it's your mother's birthday, something has happened in your brain. But the only way that you know that something has happened in your brain is that you think to yourself, goodness, I'd forgotten her birthday. And the only way that I know what's happening in your brain is that you say to me, good Lord, I'd forgotten her birthday, I must ring her up. Now, those are tremendously important differences, I think. You have the thought, you tell it to me, and that is literally the only way we can find out what the physical goings-on in our brain are. But the physical goings-on in our brain are actually quite uninteresting compared with the social goings-on when you say to me, I must ring her up, and I tell you where the telephone is, and you go and ring up, and she feels pleased, and all that happens at what we think of as the mental level. But for every one of those mental occurrences, something is happening physically, just as when you lift the telephone, something is happening in the physical world. But the significance of that is that your mother feels pleased. So we've all the time got two ways of thinking about things. One, in principle, a physical way, just as you could explain to me how the telephone works, which would be one thing. But we've also got the interpretative way, which is the human way, which is that the telephone message gives her pleasure. And those are two quite different ways of getting to know things, ways of thinking about things, which we can't eliminate.
You take the example of my remembering my mother's birthday, and this is memory. How have philosophers tried to deal with something that is so impossible to validate or to test or for you to know? How can you know about my memory, and how can you really have something to say about it?
I think philosophers have always been very much puzzled by memory. One of the worst puzzles they have is still a puzzle to us, namely, why don't you remember everything? I mean, if what memory is a kind of collection of events that have happened to you, or things that are, as we inevitably say, stored up in your mind, why is it that up to a particular point you forget that it's your mother's birthday, and then suddenly it comes into your head, something reminds you, it comes to the front of your mind. We really have very little notion why this is so, or what happens. But all philosophers have always been tempted to say that memory is a kind of storehouse in which everything that happens to you is there. So I think that we are committed to thinking that when something happens to you, it is experienced by you through your senses, through eyes, ears, whatever it is, and affects your brain, and then can be retrieved. Just as what is in the memory of a computer, what has been put in the memory of a computer, can be retrieved. And of course, in the case of computers, can be retrieved efficiently and very quickly. And that's really what a computer is, a way of retrieving very quickly a number of complicated things that have been put into it, and making connections that would take us a very long time to make laboriously. So there's a great sense, I think, in which the brain must be thought of as a kind of computer that receives a lot of impressions, which then go into the memory. and can, with luck, and sometimes be retrieved, but not always. If we had very efficient memories, we'd be better computers.
But just to go back to one of the points we've been discussing, if there are only physical objects, so to speak, does that mean that choices and values go out of the window, that free will goes out of the window?
I don't think so, because to say that there's nothing in the world except physical objects, which I believe to be true, doesn't entail that we know enough about these physical objects to be able to predict how they're going to behave. I mean, we don't even know enough about a tennis ball to be able to predict how it's going to behave when hit in a particular way and on a particular court and so on, let alone how a human equipped with this amazing, complicated brain is going to react to all the different things that happen to him when we don't even know what those different things are going to be from one minute to the next, or we know very little about that. And there are accidents and amazing, unpredictable happenings that are going to affect different people different ways and affect their choices. I mean, Spinoza in the 17th century said that freedom is ignorance of necessity. And I think there is a sense in which that's what I'm saying. In principle, it might be possible to predict the behavior of the tennis ball, but we can't. We haven't got time for playing tennis. In principle, it might be possible to predict how you are going to react tomorrow when faced with a menu in a restaurant. But we can't. We haven't got time. All we've got is the old-fashioned way of saying, what will you have? And you answer.